Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. The Panther by Ginger Winters. A man and a woman sat on a bench in the late afternoon. The man was in his prime, physically fit from spending many days in the outdoors, a man who would turn a woman's eyes when he walked into a room. The woman was young, blonde, graceful. She wore a pale yellow gown. She was beautiful, but her eyes were her most striking feature. They were grayish-green, long and narrow, with an expression that was disquieting. It brought to mind Cleopatra, who would have had such eyes. The man and the woman talked. "No," said the woman, "I love you, I do love you, but marry you? No, I cannot, will not." "But sweetheart Maria, you have said that many times, yet you always deny me a reason. I've a right to know, to understand, to prove to you that I am worthy to be your husband. I want you to be my wife. Give me a reason for your refusal." The woman was smiling through her tears, but this time it did not stir any sense of compassion in the man. He had risen and was standing before her with clenched hands, on his face a frown that showed his bitter disappointment, his anger, and his resentment at being rejected yet again. She merely sat looking up into his face with a fixed, set regard that was utterly without emotion or sentiment. Yet it had something in it that tamed his resentment and made him shiver. "You are determined to have my reason, John?" she asked in a tone that was entirely mechanical, a tone that matched the look on her face. "Please," he replied. "Very well, but if I tell you, you will think I am insane." The man startled, then looked incredulous, and was conscious that he ought to be amused. Was she joking with him? Was she truly this insensitive? "That is what the physicians would say," the woman continued, "if they knew. I might myself prefer to call it a case of possession. Sit down and hear what I have to say." The man silently resumed his seat beside her on the rustic bench. On the western side of the valley the sky was already displaying a brilliant sunset, and the stillness about them was of that peculiar quality that foretells the twilight. Something of its mysterious quality had imparted itself to the man's mood. He sat and listened to her story. In a little log house containing a single room sparsely and rudely furnished, crouching on the floor against one of the walls, was a woman, clasping to her breast a child. Outside, a dense, unbroken forest extended for many miles in every direction. This was at night, and the room was black dark. No human eye could have discerned the woman and the child. Yet they were observed, narrowly, vigilantly, with never even a momentary slackening of attention, and that is the pivotal fact upon which this story begins. Maria's father, Charles Marlowe, was of the class, now extinct in this country, of woodsmen pioneers, men who found their most acceptable surroundings in the forests that stretch along the eastern slope of the Mississippi Valley, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. For more than 100 years these men pushed ever westward, generation after generation, with rifle and axe, reclaiming from nature an isolated acreage for the plow. In the wilderness, sharing the dangers, hardships, and privations of that strange, unprofitable life, were his wife and child, to whom he was passionately attached. The woman was still young and beautiful, new enough to the awful isolation to be cheerful. One morning in midsummer, Marlowe took down his rifle from the wooden hooks on the wall with the intention of getting game. "We've meat enough," said the wife. "Please don't go out today. I dreamt last night. Oh, such a nightmare. I cannot recall it entirely, but I'm almost sure that it will come to pass if you go out." Marlowe only laughed. "It was only a dream," he said. And with a kiss for the mother and a kiss for the child, he left the house and closed the door. At nightfall he had not returned. His wife prepared supper and waited. Then she put the baby to bed and sang softly to her until she slept. By this time, the fire on the hearth at which she had cooked supper had burned out, and the room was lit by a single candle. This she placed in the open window as a sign and welcome to the hunter, if he should approach from that side. She had thoughtfully closed and barred the door against such wild animals as might prefer it to an open window. As the night wore on, she became drowsy, and at last rested her arms upon the bed by the child, with her head upon her arms. The candle in the window burned down to the stub, sputtered, and flared a moment, and went out unobserved, while the woman slept and dreamed. In her dreams, she sat beside the cradle of a second child. The first one was dead. The father was dead. The home in the forest was lost, and the dwelling in which she lived was unfamiliar. There were heavy oaken doors, always closed, and outside the windows, fastened into the thick stone walls, were iron bars, obviously, so she thought, a provision against Indians. All this she noted with an infinite self-pity, but without surprise, an emotion unknown in dreams. The child in the cradle was invisible under its coverlet, which something impelled her to remove. She did so, disclosing the face of a wild animal. In the shock of this dreadful revelation, the dreamer awoke, trembling in the darkness of her cabin. As a sense of her actual surroundings slowly came back to her, she assured herself it was only a dream, and her baby was breathing beside her. Then, moved by some impulse for which she did not understand, she rose and took the sleeping babe in her arms, holding it close against her breast. The head of the child's cot was against the wall to which the woman now turned her back as she stood. Lifting her eyes, she saw two bright objects staring into the darkness with a reddish-green glow. She took them to be two coals on the hearth, but with her returning sense of direction came the disquieting consciousness that they were not in that corner of the room. Moreover, they were too high, being nearly at the level of her own eyes. These were the eyes of a panther. The beast was near the open window, directly opposite, and not 5 paces away. Nothing but those terrible eyes was visible. Her knees failed her, and by degrees, instinctively striving to avoid a sudden movement that might bring the beast upon her, she sank to the floor, crouched against the wall, and tried to shield the babe with her trembling body without withdrawing her gaze from the luminous orbs that were watching her. Motionless now and in absolute silence, she awaited her doom, the moments growing to hours, to years, to ages, and still those devilish eyes maintained their watch. Returning to his cabin late at night with the deer on his shoulders, Marlowe tried the door. It did not yield. He knocked. There was no answer. He laid down his deer and went around to the window. As he turned the angle of the building, he fancied he heard a sound of stealthy footfalls and a rustling in the undergrowth of the forest, but they were too slight for certainty, even to his practiced ear. Approaching the window, and to his surprise finding it open, he threw his leg over the sill and entered. All was darkness and silence. He groped his way to the fireplace, struck a match, and lit a candle. Then he looked about. Cowering on the floor against a wall was his wife, clasping his child. As he sprang toward her, she rose and broke into laughter, long, loud, and mechanical, devoid of gladness and devoid of sense. Her fear had driven her mad. Hardly knowing what he did, he extended his arms. She laid the babe in them. It was dead, pressed to death in its mother's embrace. That is the story that Maria told her suitor, John, but she hadn't told him all of the story. The long summer twilight had begun to deepen in the hollows of the land. Crickets sounded, and the bats were swooping overhead in their long, graceful patterns. For some moments, John was silent, expecting the story to be carried forward to some definite connection. But Maria sat as silent as he, her face in deep thought, her hands clasping and unclasping themselves as they lay in her lap. "It is a sad, terrible story," said John at last, "but I do not understand. Please, dear, do not look away from me. You say that the child was dead, not demented, and you say that Charles was your father, but how can that be?" "Yes, he was my father, and I am the second child." John was again silent. He was a bit dazed and could not think of the right thing to say. Maria's face was still turned away. In his embarrassment, he reached impulsively toward the hands that lay closing and unclosing in her lap. She quickly withdrew them and moved farther from him on the bench. "It is likely," she resumed, "that a person born under such circumstances will be like her mother." John did not reply. He was preoccupied with his thoughts. Had Maria assumed that her mother falling into madness had somehow affected her as well? This was not a genetic disorder. This madness was specifically brought on by the terrible tragic events of that night. Didn't Maria know that? John recalled certain circumstances of the girl's history, small things she had told him over the time that he had known her. He knew she had lived a solitary life with her father, at whose house he had never been invited and did not even know where it was. He knew she had lost her mother, although she had never told him how. And he recalled her strange fear of the night. Maria lived alone in a little apartment in town and worked in a small coffee shop near his office. Other than those facts, he realized he really didn't know much about her. "Maria, dear, I beg you will not take offense, but how can you possibly assume that you inherited your poor mother's madness?" Before he could stop her, she had sprung from her seat and without another word or look was running away. He tried to stop her. He called to her and ran after her, but she had disappeared into the trees. He searched for her all night, but could not find her. In the morning, he returned home, hoping she would contact him. She did not. A week passed, and he still had not heard from her. His phone calls were not answered. She had not been at work all week. He contacted the local sheriff's department and reported her missing. John lived in a small neighborhood at the edge of the town. Directly behind the houses was the forest. His bedroom was at the rear of the house with a single window facing the trees. One night he was awakened by a noise at the window. He could hardly have said what it was. With a little thrill of the nerves, he sat up in bed and laid hold of the pistol which he kept in the bedside dresser. The room was in absolute darkness, But being a man who was unaccustomed to terror, he quickly glanced his eyes across the room to the open window. He could now dimly discern the shape of a head looking into the window, but it wasn't a human head. It looked more like a giant cat. Presently there appeared two gleaming eyes that burned with a malignant luster. John's heart gave a great jump, then seemed to stand still. A chill passed along his spine and through his hair. Slowly the shining eyes rose with a steady motion as the cat moved to jump in through the open window. John slowly rose his right hand, holding the pistol. He fired. Blinded by the flash and stunned by the rapport, John nevertheless heard, or fancied that he heard, the wild high scream of a panther, so human in sound. Leaping from the bed, he hastily clothed himself, and pistol in hand, sprang from the door and out into the yard. His closest neighbor had come out of his house, still tying the knot on his robe, and proceeded to ask John about the gunshot. A brief explanation was followed by a cautious search of the outside of the house. The grass was wet with dew, and beneath the window it had been trodden and partly leveled for a wide space, from which a distinct trail, visible in the light of the flashlight, led away into the bushes. Tracks of a large panther could barely be seen at the end of the grass, leading into the forest. John's neighbor knelt and felt the ground with his hands. On examination, they were seen to be red with blood. An encounter with a wounded panther was not something either man were looking forward to. John's neighbor returned to his home, but John, with flashlight and pistol in hand, pushed courageously forward into the woods. Passing through the difficult undergrowth, he came into a small opening, and there he found the body of his victim. But it was no panther. His darling Maria lay there in her pale yellow dress.